Picture Congress passing a law. Not a law that tells you what to do, not a law that tells a federal agency what to do, a law that tells your state government what to do, that orders your state legislature to enact the statute Congress wants, or orders your county sheriff to run a federal program on Washington's behalf. The state never volunteered, its voters never asked for it. Congress simply reached into the State House and gave the order. Can it do that? For most of the 20th century, the part of the Constitution you would point to in order to say no was treated as almost embarrassing to cite. It was the runt of the Bill of Rights the amendment law students were taught added nothing, decided nothing, changed nothing, a throat clearing at the end of the list. And then, in the space of about 25 years, that same clause was used to strike down one act of Congress, and then another, and then another. So here is the question for this primer. The 10th Amendment was for decades dismissed as stating the obvious, a clause that added nothing at all. How did it become a weapon that voids federal laws? This is Do It for the Case Law. Doctrine Deep Dive Season 0, the amendments, one at a time, one sharpest gap each. Today, the 10th here. What it authorizes, how it came to constrain, and the gap that opens between the two. Start with the text itself, because the whole puzzle is that there is so little of it. Here is the entire 10th Amendment. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. That is all of it. One sentence. And notice what it does not do. It does not grant Congress a power. It does not create a right you can hold in your hand, the way the First Amendment gives you the freedom of speech or the Sixth gives you a jury. It looks backward, not forward. It takes the design the Constitution already set up, a federal government of limited enumerated powers, a government that can do only the specific things the document lists, and it restates the leftover principle, whatever was not handed to the federal government, and not forbidden to the states, stays where it already was, with the states or with the people. Think about why that felt redundant. The rest of the Constitution had already done the work. Article 1 gives Congress a list of powers to tax, to spend, to regulate commerce, to raise armies, and so on. If a power is not on the list and cannot be fairly implied from it, Congress does not have it. Full stop. So what does the 10th Amendment add? On its face, nothing. It just says the leftovers are reserved, which was already true the moment the framers chose to enumerate powers instead of granting all of them. It reads like a summary of the deal, written into the deal. A closing sentence that tells you how to read all the sentences before it. It helps to remember why the framers bothered to write it down at all. When the Constitution was up for ratification, a lot of people were frightened of the new national government, frightened that a distant capital would swallow the states whole. The Reserved Powers Clause was reassurance, a promise in the text that the federal government would be one of listed powers only and everything else stayed home. So the sentence was doing political work in 1791 even if it added no new legal rule. Which is precisely why, for a long time afterward, courts treated it as close to meaningless, comforting language, but not a lever you could actually pull. That was the settled view for a century and a half. Watch what the court did with it. Listen to how the Supreme Court described this amendment in 1941 in a case called United States versus Darby, a description the court would repeat when the modern story finally begins. The 10th Amendment, the court said, states, but a truism that all is retained which has not been surrendered. A truism, something so obviously true it does no work at all. And the court went further. In that same passage, there is nothing in the history of its adoption to suggest that it was more than declaratory of the relationship between the national and state governments. Declaratory. It declares it does not command. For decades, that was the settled view. The 10th Amendment was a mirror held up to the rest of the Constitution, reflecting limits that already existed and adding none of its own. If you had stood up in court in the middle of the 20th century and said this federal law violates the 10th Amendment, a judge might have looked at you as though you had cited the preamble. Now watch the court give the mirror teeth. The turn comes in 1992 in New York versus United States. Congress had passed a law about the disposal of low-level radioactive waste, and one piece of that law, the part the court zeroed in on, told the states, in effect, regulate this waste according to our specifications, or you will be deemed to take legal title to the waste, and with it every bit of liability for the harm it causes. Enact our program or own the problem. Justice O'Connor, writing for the court, drew a hard line. Here is the holding verbatim. The federal government may not compel the states to enact or administer a federal regulatory program. Read that slowly because it is the whole doctrine in one sentence. Not should not, may not, cannot. And the court gave the principle a name, or rather a verb. Quoting an earlier decision, it said the take title provision was invalid because, and I am quoting, the act commandeers the legislative processes of the states by directly compelling them to enact and enforce a federal regulatory program, commandeers. That is the word that names the whole doctrine from here forward, anti-commandeering. Congress cannot commandeer a state legislature. It cannot sit in the state house and pull the levers of state lawmaking as if the state's own legislators were federal employees taking dictation. The court also anticipated the government's cleverest defense that this was not really coercion, because the states had a choice, regulate our way or take title. and the court rejected it in a single memorable line, verbatim. A choice between two unconstitutionally coercive regulatory techniques is no choice at all. Offering a state two unconstitutional options is not offering it freedom. So the take title provision fell. A clause that added nothing had just erased a piece of a federal statute. 5 years later, in 1997, the court closed the obvious escape hatch. The case is Printz versus United States. After New York, you might imagine Congress had a workaround sitting right there. Fine.
We will not order the state legislature to pass a law. We will just order state officials to carry out our program directly. Skip the state house, go straight to the sheriff.
And the federal granted gun control law did exactly that. It commanded local chief law enforcement officers to run background checks on prospective handgun buyers on the federal government's behalf during the years before a national background check system came online. Justice Scalia, writing for the court, shut the workaround down. Listen to how tightly he framed it. Congress cannot compel the states to enact or enforce a federal regulatory program. Today, we hold that Congress cannot circumvent that prohibition by conscripting the state's officers directly, and then the rule itself. Verbatim, the federal government may neither issue directives requiring the states to address particular problems, nor command the state's officers or those of their political subdivisions to administer or enforce a federal regulatory program.
So now both doors are shut. Congress may not command the state legislature to make law, and it may not command the state's executive officers to enforce federal law. It cannot get through the front door or the back. The state government is not Washington's field office, and its officials are not federal staff waiting for assignments. And notice how far this is from a truism. A truism does not tell a sitting sheriff he cannot be conscripted. This is a live rule with real targets. For a while, you could still tell yourself this was a narrow, somewhat technical rule, something about federal programs conscripting state machinery, of interest mainly to specialists. Then came 2018 and Murphy versus National Collegiate Athletic Association, the case that shows just how much force the 10th Amendment now carries. The law in question was a federal statute called PASPA, the Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act, and one of its provisions made it unlawful for a state to authorize sports gambling. Sit with how strange that is. It was not a command to run a federal program, it was a command that the states keep their own laws against sports betting on the books, whether they wanted to or not. New Jersey had decided to repeal its ban, and PASPA said it could not. The court struck the provision down. Here is the holding verbatim. PASPA's provision prohibiting state authorization of sports gambling schemes violates the anti-commandeering rule, and the court refused to soften it into something less than a command. Quoting the opinion again, there is simply no way to understand the provision prohibiting state authorization as anything other than a direct command to the states, and that is exactly what the anti-commandeering rule does not allow. A federal statute telling a state what its own law must say, that is commandeering, and it falls. And in Murphy, the court finally said out loud what the doctrine is really about. Quoting the opinion, the anti-commandeering doctrine may sound arcane, but it is simply the expression of a fundamental structural decision incorporated into the Constitution. The decision, in the court's words, to withhold from Congress the power to issue orders directly to the states. That is the theory of the entire line of cases, stated plainly. The federal government was handed certain enumerated powers, and the power to issue direct orders to the state governments was simply never among them. It was left off the list on purpose. Then the court did something useful. It explained why it cares so much, and gave 3 reasons that are worth having in your head. First, it said, the rule serves as one of the Constitution's structural protections of liberty. The idea is old and structural. Divide power between 2 levels of government, and neither one can grow large enough by itself to crush your freedom. Federalism is not decoration, it is a safety mechanism. Second, and this one is subtle but powerful, the anti-commandeering rule promotes political accountability. When Congress makes you do something and pretends it was your state's idea, it blurs the lines of blame. But when the levels of government stay in their lanes, in the court's words, voters who like or dislike the effects of the regulation know who to credit or blame. You can throw the right people out of office because you can tell whose decision it actually was. And third, the rule prevents Congress from shifting the costs of regulation to the states, because if Washington could simply order states to administer and pay for federal programs, it could take the credit for the program while sending the bill somewhere else. The Murphy court itself put the through line simply, looking back at the 2 decisions it was building on. In its words, in New York, we held that a federal law unconstitutionally ordered the state to regulate in accordance with federal standards. And in Printz, we found that another federal statute unconstitutionally compelled state officers to enforce federal law. 2 statutes down before Murphy ever arrived, and Murphy made 3. So look at what happened across those 3 cases. New York, Congress cannot order a state legislature to legislate. Printz, Congress cannot order a state's officers to enforce federal law. Murphy, Congress cannot order a state to keep a law it wants to repeal. 3 federal enactments, or pieces of them, struck down by the amendment that supposedly added nothing. And notice the arc, each case reached a little further than the last. New York was about being forced to act. Printz was about state officials being conscripted. Murphy was about a state being forbidden to change its own law. The doctrine did not sit still, it grew. Now, you might conclude from all that the states have been placed genuinely beyond Washington's reach. Before you do, think about how federal policy actually arrives in your state. Almost never as a command.
Almost always as an offer.
Congress has the power to spend, and when it spends, it can attach conditions. Take the money, follow the rules, refuse the rules, lose the money. No order is ever issued, so nothing is commandeered, and yet the state ends up doing exactly what Washington wanted. The case that made this concrete is South Dakota versus Dole, decided in 1987. Congress wanted a national drinking age of 21. Whether it had the power to simply impose one was doubtful. So it did not impose one. It passed a statute directing that a state which allowed anyone under 21 to drink would lose a percentage of its federal highway money. South Dakota, which let 19-year-olds buy low-alcohol beer, sued. And the court upheld the condition. Listen to the reasoning, verbatim. Even if Congress might lack the power to impose a national minimum drinking age directly, we conclude that encouragement to state action found in Section 158 is a valid use of the spending power. Sit with that sentence because it is doing something remarkable in the open. The court is saying assume Congress could not command this, it can still buy it. The power Congress lacks at the front door it holds through the checkbook. And it worked. Every state moved its drinking age to 21. Not one of them was ordered to. The court did draw a line, at least on paper. It acknowledged, quoting an earlier case, that in some circumstances the financial inducement offered by Congress might be so coercive as to pass the point at which pressure turns into compulsion. At some threshold, an offer stops being an offer. But in Dole itself, the court found nothing close to that threshold, describing what Congress had done as, in its words, relatively mild encouragement. For 25 years, that line existed only in theory. No federal spending condition was ever held to cross it. Then, in 2012, one finally did, in National Federation of Independent Business versus Sumelius, the first great challenge to the Affordable Care Act. The act expanded Medicaid and told the states that if they declined the expansion, the federal government could cut off not merely the new money, but all of their existing Medicaid funding. Chief Justice Roberts measured that against Dole and found it different in kind. Quoting the opinion, the financial inducement here is much more than relatively mild encouragement. It is a gun to the head. And then the court did something unusually concrete. It put numbers on the difference. The highway money in Dole amounted to less than half of 1% of South Dakota's budget. Small enough that refusing it remained, in the court's phrase, a prerogative of the states not merely in theory but in fact. The Medicaid threat was another animal entirely. Quoting the opinion, the threatened loss of over 10% of a state's overall budget, in contrast, is economic dragooning that leaves the states with no real option but to acquiesce. Economic dragooning. Half of 1% is an offer. 10% of your state's entire budget is a gun. Somewhere between those two numbers, a bargain stops being a bargain, and for the first time since Dole, a spending condition was held unconstitutional. So hold both halves of this together, because neither one is the whole picture. Congress may not command a state. That rule is real, and it has taken down 3 federal statutes. But Congress may pay a state and attach conditions to the payment, and unless the sum is crushing enough to count as dragooning, that arrangement stands. Most of what Washington wants from your state government, it does not demand, it purchases. Which brings us to the gap. Here is the thesis, and it runs the opposite direction from almost every other gap on this show. Usually we show you a guarantee that reads big and turns out small, a promise the doctrine quietly narrows until the individual ends up with less than the words seem to offer. The 10th Amendment is the mirror image of that. It reads small and turned out big. On its face, it is declaratory, a truism. The court itself said that all is retained which has not been surrendered. Nothing in those words announces that they can void an act of Congress. And yet, once the court decided to enforce the sentence rather than merely recite it, that flat, backward-looking clause became a live structural limit with the power to strike federal statutes off the books, reshaping the balance between Washington and the states 2 full centuries after the words were ratified. That is the gap worth sitting with. The text did not change. Not one word of the 10th Amendment was rewritten between 1941, when it was but a truism, and 1992, when it started striking down statutes. What changed was the court's willingness to treat the sentence as an enforceable rule instead of a description of a rule found elsewhere. And that should unsettle any tidy story in which a clause's meaning is simply fixed once and for all at the moment of ratification. Here, the same fixed words did almost nothing for a century and a half and then did a great deal because doctrine, not text standing alone, decides when truism becomes a weapon. The 10th Amendment is proof that a constitutional provision can gain power over time, not just lose it. And that the gap between what a clause says and what it does can open in the direction of more force, not less. But there is a second half to that gap, and it cuts the other way. The 10th Amendment's new force is real, and it is narrow. It bars commands, it does not bar offers. So the very era that turned reserve to the states into an enforceable limit left the largest channel of federal influence, money, with conditions attached, very nearly wide open. The clause grew teeth for the thing Congress rarely does, and stayed quiet about the thing Congress does constantly. If you want to know how much is actually reserved to your state, do not only count the statutes struck down, count the conditions your state has already accepted. One more thing about Murphy, because the case did something that shows you exactly how much force this clause now carries, and it happened in the part of the opinion nobody quotes. Once the court held that forbidding a state to authorize sports gambling was unconstitutional commandeering, it had to decide what happened to the rest of the statute. Ordinarily, a court saves what it can. The presumption runs strongly toward cutting out the bad part and leaving the working part standing. Here, the court refused. It struck the provisions barring states from operating, sponsoring, or promoting sports gambling, and then it went further and struck the provision aimed at private individuals, people rather than states, who ran sports betting under state law. The whole act came down. That is a real jump, and it is worth naming. The anti-commandeering rule is about what Congress may say to a state government. On its own terms, it has nothing whatever to say about a federal law that regulates private citizens. But because the court concluded Congress would not have wanted the leftovers, a 10th Amendment holding took the private conduct provisions down with it. A case comment in the Harvard Law Review argues the majority departed from the traditional severability test in 3 separate ways and warns the approach may point toward courts saving fewer regulatory schemes in future. 2 justices dissented on precisely that point, arguing the court ordinarily engages in a salvage rather than a demolition. Whether or not you find that critique persuasive, notice the arithmetic. A clause the court once called a truism did not merely erase the piece of a federal statute it actually reached. It erased the statute. And if all of that sounds academic, look at where this doctrine actually lives right now. Because Congress may not command a state, it cannot order your state police or your county sheriff to help enforce federal law. That is Printz, and it is the constitutional foundation underneath every so-called sanctuary policy in the country, the state and local rules that decline to give federal officers assistance. Most people hear that word and think immigration, and the largest group of these policies are in fact immigration sanctuaries. But the very same rule protects the other kind, the states and counties that have declared they will not help enforce federal gun regulations. Ilya Somin, a law professor writing for the Brennan Center's State Court Report, and I will say plainly that is a commentary outlet with a point of view, not neutral research, makes exactly that point. Sanctuary policies run in both directions, left and right, and they stand on the same constitutional ground. Sit with that for a second. A doctrine that began as a fight about where to put low-level radioactive waste and now helps decide whether your county has to assist with a federal deportation or a federal gun case. Nobody in those fights is claiming a right. No individual liberty is being asserted. It is purely a question of who may give orders to whom, and the answer turns on a sentence people spent a century and a half calling a truism. There is one scholarly caution to set against all this, and it is a good one. Van Dut and Bridget Fahey, writing in the Columbia Law Review in 2024, argue that the conventional wisdom that states are basically free to structure their own governments as they like is overstated, and that the court has drawn on a scattered, often conflicting set of constitutional provisions to build a much broader body of federal rules about state structure than the federalism canon ever admits. So before you conclude the states have been handed their sovereignty back, count the other doors. The same court has walked through a lot of them. That is the sample. A full Amendment 10 season on this show would take the anti-commandeering line case by case, New York and the rule against commandeering a state legislature, Printz and the ban on conscripting state officers, Murphy and the reach into a state's own power to repeal its laws and then work the harder country around its edges. Exactly where the coercion line now falls after Sebelius finally drew one. How conditional spending shapes everything from highway funds to schools to healthcare, and what is really left of reserve to the states once federal dollars are on the table. One doctrinal question per episode, each anchored in cases we verify, not remember. A quick word on how this show works. Everything you just heard is legal education, not legal advice. We are teaching how the doctrine moves, not telling you what to do in any situation of your own. And everything is built on real, named, verified cases: New York versus United States, Printz versus United States, Murphy versus National Collegiate Athletic Association, South Dakota versus Dole, and National Federation of Independent Business versus Sebelius were all pulled from the court's own opinions before I wrote a word, and every citation is in the show notes. That is the whole ethos, and it is the name of the show. Do it for the case law. I'll see you at the next amendment.